Hello there, it is a fine day and thanks for watching. Today I will be replacing a rear wheel bearing and hub on my 2004 Toyota Corolla. Another thing to note is this procedure works for a 2003 to 2008 model Toyota Corolla. Any of those, this procedure will apply to. So I wanted to bring up a couple of safety notes if you're doing this job yourself. Right here you see me using a jack stand. The reason for this is because I cannot use the emergency brake if I want to get the drum off. So you don't want to set the emergency brake. For an automatic, you can just put it in park. For this is a manual transmission. I put it in reverse since it's facing downhill. And rather than block the wheel, I just rest it on a jack stand here. At this point I realized the drum was actually seized because it had rusted to the hub. The next step for me was to find a way to get this drum off. So what I decided to do was put the lug nuts back on because I knew I was going to have to hammer it a little bit, and I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to get the hub off, and I needed to be able to reinstall the wheel since it's my only car that I can drive at the moment. So that's why I'm putting the lug nuts back on. Not necessary, but if it's your only mode of transportation, you don't want to risk damaging the threads and not being able to get the lug nuts back on. So the tool you see me using here is actually it's kind of like a threaded pin. It's the right thread pitch and diameter to thread into the bolt holes. They provide a couple of bolt holes on this drum that allows you to put a bolt in it, and then you just tighten the bolt until it pops loose and it'll break it free from that rust. So the problem that I had was this is brass, so I didn't want to tighten it too much. I needed to tighten it to where there was tension and then wrap on it a little bit. You want to wrap on the very edge of the drum, and it'll keep you away from the lugs, but also it'll help the drum to pop loose. Typically what you'll want to do is take two of these bolts that are the proper thread pitch and thread them into this drum, and just tighten them evenly until the drum pops loose. And if it takes a bit, rather than destroy the threads either in the drum or on the bolts that you're using, you still want to wrap on it until it pops loose. But in my case here, I had to switch sides because I only had one of these tools. Otherwise I was going to have to go to the hardware store and bail on the job until I could actually get the drum off and get a couple of correct bolts. Just a little side note, apparently I didn't have a hammer. I thought I had one in my toolbox, but I didn't. So here I am using the lug wrench as a hammer. So that's another reason why I was very careful and also very, let's just say, not wailing on it as hard as I probably would have otherwise. A brass hammer will work perfectly fine in situations like this. Brass helps you to not damage the threads on the lugs in case you need to reinstall. And it'll also, prevent damage to that drum surface as well. So just like you see me doing here, you'd want to do, if you're doing this job yourself, you just slowly tighten those bolts, giving it a few reps. And, depending on how rusted it is, of course, you'll change the force with which you're hitting it. But just tighten the bolts a little bit, give it a few hits, do that evenly on both sides. Eventually that drum will pop loose. So this bearing was very bad, and I could hear the flat spots in the bearing just spinning it by hand. Sometimes that's not the case, but just have a listen. So there are 4 bolts on the back side of this hub that hold this bearing assembly on. And what you see me doing here is positioning to take those 4 bolts off. And they are 12mm bolts. So in case you're trying to figure out what size socket you need, these are 12mm. I've got a 1/2-inch drive ratchet here. It makes the job super easy, but these are not super tight. So you could probably do this with a regular ratchet, but of course I'm on easy mode with this massive breaker bar ratchet here. Also, the lower bolts, you'll either need a deep well socket or just a 3-inch extension, just so that you can reach them, because that frame piece just below where I'm at will definitely block you from getting those lower bolts. So once you have those bolts out, the backing plate for the brakes and the hub assembly as well will be loose from that frame piece. And you need to be careful not to just pull it off, because as you can see, there's a brake line that attaches to that backing plate and the wheel cylinder on the back. If you are doing it the shortcut way, like I'm doing it here, you're actually leaving the backing plate and all the brake components in place. Technically, you're supposed to take them apart, but that's why I'm doing this video, to show you a shortcut way to do it the safe way, that you don't damage anything. So what I'm doing here is trying to separate this hub assembly from both the frame piece and the backing plate as well. So what you'll see me do here is pry between the housing of the brake shoe, or the brake metal plate, so that I don't damage the brake material itself, and the back side of the hub. And then of course I'm going to hold the opposite side of the backing plate and brake components, so that it doesn't allow it to kind of move out of place. But what I'm trying to do here is separate the hub from the backing plate. It's still a little corroded on there, and I'm just trying to do it really carefully so I don't bend the brake line or anything like that. You just need to be really careful not to overextend that. It's a super, super important component not to mess up. And so here I think I've got it a little loose, and I can just put a little bit of hand pressure between the plate and the back of the bearing hub and pop it right out. And there it is. The bearing and hub assembly is out. And all we have to do is just make sure that we align everything back when we put it back together. I'm going to clean up some of the brake dust here. Try to get some of that off while I've got this out. This is what a healthy bearing should sound like. As you'll notice here, there's a top and a bottom, so there is an orientation that you need to pay attention to here. The wider holes go at the top, the ones that are closer together go at the bottom. At this point, you'll want to make sure the bolt holes that go through the frame piece align with the backing plate holes before you seat it into place. It's just so much easier to do it this way. And I'm going to show you here how it seats through the backing plate and then into the frame piece. So it's real simple. Now it's time to put the bolts back in, but of course I misaligned the holes just a little bit, so I had to tweak this just a little bit in order to get those bolts to go through and thread in. But like I said, way easier to line this up in advance. So I'm going through here and just snugging up the bolts, zeroing them out, because what I like to do is use a torque wrench, especially on components like this. So I don't like to skip this step. I know a lot of guys that just run them in with an impact or something, or hand tighten them. I like to use a torque wrench. So the torque is 45 foot-pounds for this particular bearing housing. So one of the things about using a torque wrench is you want smooth, even swings. So you don't want to be jerking the bar at all. So I'm going to get these zeroed with the wrench past the snug point, and you'll hear it click once it gets to torque. Much like a wheel, once I torque them all, I like to go back and double check. Just hit them one more time, make sure that they're at torque, and we're good to go. Pro tip here, if the drum doesn't want to go on, sometimes the shoes will shift up or down a little bit. You just knock it a little bit and it'll go back into place, and just keep trying to put it on gently until the drum slides right in. what you'll see me do here is spin it, double check that it's seated, and then just kind of listen for the proper adjustment on those brake shoes. So now it's time to put the wheel back on. The torque is 80 foot-pounds I like to use for the Toyotas. It's a 21 millimeter socket. This probably goes without saying, but of course you want to make sure that the wheel is seated properly on the hub before you go torquing the lug nuts down. So I like to zero them by hand and then torque them. Now it's time to set the emergency brake and lock the wheel so you can torque. As I mentioned before, you want smooth, even pressure, no jerking, and you should hear that torque wrench click for you. This is a split beam. You could use one of the old-fashioned beam torque wrenches as well. I like these because you don't have to reset them or dial anything back. So I like these split beam torque wrenches. Now for the double check pass, just to make sure they're all evenly tight. Thanks for watching, and that's how you replace a wheel bearing and hub assembly on an 04 Corolla in 30 minutes.